since yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, we want to open it up with a land acknowledgement. And so we honor this land acknowledgement. And since this conference is being held online, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of the distribution across many locations. We invite you to consider your own position with regard to the land where you find yourself. With these words, we honor the history and contributions of Native peoples in these regions. We pledge to remain vigilant and engage in the protection of Native peoples and Native water. We ask that you take a moment of silence to pay respect to elders past and present and extend our recognition to their descendant. And we also want to hold space for any First Nation voices to speak or type as we're on a webinar, should they wish to acknowledge the land that they are on.
Thank you. Ismalis and I would like to name that we are honored to be on the ancestral lands of the Council of the Three Fires, which are composed of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Ottawa nations. So thank you all for being here this evening and engaging in our conversation about what do we do now. And this is really going to be a conversation between me and Ismalis. And as you feel moved, feel free to put some questions and answers and we will get to them. But we're gonna do a little bit of conversation and grounding first. Ismalis, should we share with folks how we came to this work and how we came to know each other?
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it gives a little context. I was actually told this story earlier today, and Christine and I met back in 2016. And for me, that feels like it was so long ago. And Christine was working for a project called National Seed Project, and that is seeking educational equity and diversity. And I had this opportunity to go and become a facilitator and to build some capacity about what it meant to bring this work to a school district. It was in 2016, the first time that I had identified as a person of color, and I had reclaimed my name. And so that was kind of the first time Christine and I met. And throughout the course of our existence, we kind of started reconnecting again, as I would say. And for the last 2 years, we were facilitating courageous conversations about race across the country. And so we were doing that predominantly with schools, teachers, students, for me, families, the adults in the students' lives. And so here we are. Currently today, I am a consultant and own my own business, and Christine has done the same. And so full circle, here we are talking about what it means to be in interracial relationships. Did I miss anything, Christine?
No.
All right.
So, I think I'll only add that as a white woman doing this work, I'm really clear that I would not be facilitating and holding space full-time racial equity conversations, racial justice conversations, had it not been for the patience and mentoring of people of color in my life, in particular Black women. And so I hold space in my purpose of organizing more white folks to come into the conversation, but I do it in a way that is accountable to and in solidarity with folks of color. And so as we embark in this conversation about what does it mean to be an interracial partnership, I wanted to ask one question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So when you say, because I know in my own racial identity, if I had met a Black Latina who said, I didn't identify as a person of color until 4 years ago, I might find that confusing.
Ooh, thank you. And I sigh because there was a lot of shame and guilt with that, even acknowledging that and saying that. I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so I was surrounded by people that really looked like me. And when I say that, I mean we shared cultural values and beliefs, right? And I grew up in a predominantly Puerto Rican and Cuban American household. And I grew up in what I would say right now is to be colorblind, right? And noticing that there is ableism rooted in that because there actually are people who are colorblind. But I grew up in this house where my family, you know, I got these messages where it was said, if people were just nice to you, that's all that matters. And you just work hard and everything will just go away. But what I didn't realize that as much as I wanted to identify as Puerto Rican and Cuban, I didn't realize that my Blackness entered the room before anything else. And for me, it was confusing too, right? That I heavily identified as this Puerto Rican and Cuban young girl in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and yet I fought so hard to have to prove that identity to so many people around me. And so oftentimes I was either too Black to be around folks that were Latinx or Hispanic, or too Latina to be around people who identified as Black or African American. And so it left me in this place of confusion. And it was shameful, right? Because I would be around people who were like, who know who you are? You don't speak the language correctly. Like, what's wrong with you? And then really building this capacity as I went on to my seed journey, and understanding that race, even though it's a social construct, played a part in all the ways in which I navigated and all the experiences that I had growing up from the very time I was born till today. And so very confusing indeed. And when I say that I am US Black, Puerto Rican, and Cuban American, I'm very clear the ways in which Blackness can also be separated out by location and region, right? What does it mean to be US Black, Midwest Black versus Caribbean Black? And have maybe race in common, skin, but cultural values and beliefs that are different.
Yeah. As I listen to your story, I think about my own racial identity and my own confusion, which I will not say was similar, and I was confused. Growing up where I grew up, I also had the really strong message to be colorblind from my parents. And yet I was also getting messages that were about communities of color that weren't colorblind. So there was a lot of confusion there. And I also didn't identify as white, really, because I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania during the 1980s, and I was in the punk rock scene. And there was a large, growing neo-Nazi skinhead scene. And so they were the people who identified as white. They're the people who said, I'm white, like, I'm proud, I'm white. And they were completely racist and horrible and violent. And so I was like, I don't want to be that. So I didn't have a lot of models because all my other white folks were saying, oh, we're colorblind, but like quietly not colorblind. And so it was confusing for me too, until I became a teacher. And that's when I went through SEED myself as a participant and had that question of, and what messages did you get about race? And how does it affect your racial identity? And that's when I finally became able to say, like, the white supremacists, the white nationalists don't get to own being white. That as long as the social construction exists, like, I am also white. People see me and they see white. My experience is culturally very white, and that's okay. But I think I would not be able to have the relationship that I have with you if I had held to the color blindness And like, no, race is about people of color. Like, you're so interesting. You're so, like, but that's not authentic.
Well, and that's what I heard a lot growing up. You're different. You're not like those people. And I think that compounded the confusion, right? My father is a Black Cuban. And to hear him talk about other folks of color was very confusing for me, because I was like, I thought we were supposed to be united, right? Like, I'd hear all these messages in school about being united in a community and as one, but yet the behaviors around me were very different. And I'm not going to lie, I internalized a lot of those messages. And I think oftentimes that's where some of my self-hate developed, because I didn't see people that looked like me. And so that confusion, I've been very clear on what that confusion has brought. Is the answers has brought a lot of liberation into understanding that, yeah, that was something you heard to be ashamed of. And yet, what does it mean to actually live and believe that you are enough? So, Christine, I'm thinking about the ways, as you talk about your story and growing up, and I'm thinking about like racial reckoning, I'm thinking about COVID. And I know my experience with COVID, but just wondering how it's impacted you. COVID has impacted you as a white woman.
Yeah. So I think about a couple things with how COVID has affected me as a white woman. So in the work that I do, I work really hard to activate my own racial consciousness. And what are the times when I'm almost like lulled away from like thinking about things in racial terms because I'm white. And I think about COVID in particular, seeing the ways, first of all, when it first hit and a lot of the anti-Asian racism hit, and seeing my friends and family who are Asian American dealing with just this escalated racism that was being activated by some folks in power and the language that they were using to describe COVID. And then when we started to see the numbers and just to see the disproportionality, I've had friends who've gotten COVID and I haven't lost anyone to COVID. I have multiple friends of color, Black and Latinx, brown Latinx, who've lost people. And I'm also aware of that that's a conscious choice I need to make as a white person to keep that racial dynamic. And then, to be honest, even the ways when you walked to my house that one day when we went for the walk and you were wearing your black mask over your face and you had your hoodie on because it was a little bit cold because it was the spring. And you said, "So I look like I'm going to rob someone right now."
I remember that day.
And I don't have to think about that when I have my hoodie on and my mask on. It's just not a dynamic that I experience.
Yeah. And I think for me, just that simple fact as a Black Latina, like walking to your house during COVID, I thought, okay, I can do this. I'm alone. I've lived alone for almost 18 years. I got this. And yet what I didn't realize is that it was so isolating that moments like me getting ready to walk to your house with a mask on were exhausting. That I had to think about the ways in which I don't look like I could be doing something wrong. That I'm just innocently walking to my friend's house, who is white. And so I think about that constantly, things that brought me joy once, which were like grocery shopping. I love to cook. And how COVID and the summer of racial reckoning actually they were very intertwined with one another. And so I thought COVID beginning, I'm cool. And then George Floyd hit. And then I thought, this is going to get really bad. And things that once brought me joy and love were actually terrorizing me at the same time. And so I got to the point where I didn't feel comfortable enough to go grocery shopping. And yet I didn't have anyone else that could help, or at least I didn't think. Because I had this belief growing up as a Black Latina, Black woman at that, is you take care of your house, you go do your own groceries, you get it done. But what about when race is layered on top of that? And so I just think about that dynamic of like what it means for you to be in white skin and what it means for me to be in this skin that I am, and that's Black. That's what people see first when I walk through a door.
I know part of our title tonight is like, what can we do?
Yeah.
And so I just want to name that as a white person of just being, like I said, I need to be aware of and think about the racial dynamics of something. I need to ask myself that question. I need to have that conversation with my white friends and family who might not be having those conversations. And there's that aspect of not allowing race to not be present in our conversations.
Yeah.
So for me to not, when you said like, I just walked here with my hoodie and my mask and I'm a little bit freaked out. An older version of me and my white racial consciousness would have like cracked a joke and changed the subject.
Yeah.
Versus just staying present and, listening and then asking, if there's anything I can do.
Well, I'm thinking about the ways that you just said crack a joke. Racial disconscious, and I'm going to say Molly or Izzy, right? Because when I think about the ways that race played out, even in me reclaiming my name and how it was shortened over time to make it easier for other folks, I think about, I probably would have sat there and cracked a joke with you too. Because I think about the ways in which if there's a joke or it's just bypass, maybe sometimes it will be easier for me not to have to think about all the racial reckoning happening right now. And what does it mean for me to be in my moments where I actually just need you as a white person to listen and to hold my stories of race, even when I don't want to put it on the table? You are. And so I think about that and the ways in which we think about, like you're talking about what it means for you as a white woman, but like, I'm like, and what's my role? And growing up, I did not have this belief that I could have white friends where I talked about race. I had white friends and I love them. And what did it mean for the absence of race and that conversation not to be there? And so I just started internalizing, it's just not that bad. No one else is going on. It's not happening to anybody else. And I'm not gonna lie, at times it made me feel like I was crazy. Don't you see this? And so I appreciate that you naming that, right? Like even when I can't put race on the table or don't want to, you will create some space to do that for me. So I think about this notion of just relationship, Christine, what it means to be in just interracial relationships and just intra-racial relationships, meaning within race. What has that journey been like for you? Like, I know you mentioned Black women, but like, I often wonder, like, how did you know or understand like something needs to be flipped here? I need to do some reframing or some unlearning.
So 2 stories come to mind. One is about a student. So when I was in the classroom and I was teaching a Black novel to a predominantly white class with 1 Black student. And in my head, I wanted to have the like Hollywood version. Like, I'm going to be the white teacher who gets this right, and you know, she's going to click with me and she's going to love me. And you know, at the time I thought that simply having a book by a person of color in my curriculum was doing the work.
Yeah.
What I didn't know was that in my racial consciousness and not really explicitly teaching about racial identity, I ended up reinforcing a bunch of stereotypes about Black people to my white students. And by the end of the class, like, the Black girl could barely make eye contact with me. And so when you say just relationship, a relationship based on justice. So I had a choice at that moment. I could pretend it never happened. I could tell myself stories like, oh, she's got a lot of other issues going on. This isn't about me. This isn't about my class. So I could have created a lot of stories about that. And I didn't. I listened to what I call my integrity twitch, which said, this is not right. Mm. And so I started to take action. And by actions, I meant I started to go learn. Like, what do I need to learn? Like, what do I need to learn about myself as a white person? What do I need to learn about interracial relationships? What do I need to learn about teaching literacy from a racially conscious standpoint? Because I went to excellent schools. I had an excellent education. But excellent for whom? And then that led me to putting myself into a lot of situations where I started building relationships across race. And then that's when I had to have just relationship, which I guess one thing that I will say for those of you who identify as white who might be watching or listening, Brian Stevenson will talk about proximity, if you know Brian Stevenson and Just Mercy. And proximity is just the first step, because the next piece of proximity is being in just relationship with folks who are different than you are. And so for me, that was being in just relationship with folks of color, which meant that I had to listen to the feedback that they gave me. And that's another one of those points when I had a decision chance of like, I could get defensive. I could insist on how I'm a good person. I'm not the racist person. I'm here in the racial justice workshop, and like not take in the feedback. But what I worked on doing was reframing so that the feedback was meant that this person of color, this Black woman, trusts that I'm going to do something with the feedback. And that's just relationship. You've taken the risk as a Black woman to give me feedback as a white woman about the impact I'm having. Now the justice comes in either I can minimize, defend, dismiss, argue away, disengage, or I can think about how do I use this to transform myself and be in good relationship, be in just relationship.
It's interesting because I think about the questions of like, you and Christine, what's that about? What's that relationship, that dynamic? What do you see in that white girl? I'm like, everything. I see the things that I was not able to see as a kid. And when you talk about just relationships, Christine, the one thing that sticks with me as you say that is always to an injustice with you. And I think about the ways in which I've shared some really personal, intimate things that have been rooted in race and have been racist. And oftentimes thinking about what I needed in those spaces. And it's not always the same, right? I think that's the other thing. I think for me, there are times where I shut down because I'm like, am I in denial? Did this just really happen? Are we in 2020? Mm-hmm. Right? So I'm shocked. And then I have times where I'm like, I need to talk to somebody who can do something with this. And when I say do something with it, it's not fix it. It's actually to hold my story and not go run rogue and do something on my behalf without consent. And so I think about just relationships for me as a Black Latina, of like what that means to actually sit with you, let you know, you process, and you ask, like, so we gonna do something about this? What we gonna do? You good? You need my help? And I think for me, that has been comforting because I never had the belief that that was possible. From all what I learned about white people around me, I learned, yeah, you can be in relationship, you break bread, cool. But like, what do you mean? What does it mean when you break bread and you actually are talking about head and heart work when it's related to race and racism? And that you actually wanted to know my story. That's been huge for me.
I think about what bearing witness means.
Yeah.
So this question of what does it mean to bear witness to someone else's story, someone else's experience that's different from mine. And I just think about what does it mean to stay present to? And then I also think about staying present in a way that's not just like silently listening and giving you no feedback, right? Like, what does it mean to engage and to build the trust in relationship? And I want to say this because I think this is important for white folks. And I made this mistake often. Is that I would just, like I kind of alluded to it in my story, like, you know, I would just assume trust. Well, like, look, I'm a white person showing up at this workshop. Like, don't you automatically trust me? But the truth is that I was kind of fueled by a kind of desperate need for people of color to like me and validate me and tell me that I wasn't a bad person. And that's not mutually authentic. And I was kind of hard to be around during that phase for me. And that's why I thank the, you know, and I really do acknowledge the patience of the folks of color in my life who stuck with me through that and helped me see how I was kind of exhausting to be a friend because it was all about me. And so staying present to and bearing witness to a story doesn't turn it into a story about me as a white person.
I'm just thinking about when I got my own racial consciousness as a Black Latina. And I thought, oh yeah, it's my job. I'm a Black woman. I'm about to end racism. I laugh at that now because that was literally my belief. Like, I got this position. I am about to end racism in this district and we're not going to have an opportunity or an achievement gap. And what I didn't know, kind of parallel to what you just named, is what did it mean for me to have grace with other folks that looked like me? And for the white folks that didn't, and what it meant to actually hold space. Now, there was some things I had to learn, like not to caretake, the tears, all of that, but that's why it's been so important for me to be in just relationships with you, to understand like this conversation of race and racism, we can have it. And I, as a Black woman, can have some parameters and boundaries. And not be in control, because I hate that word control when I think about whiteness. But what does it mean for me to be able to be a steward of that conversation instead of constantly hurt by it?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about what do we do now? And I just think about me and my skin as a Black Latina and like what it means for me to hold grace and space for other people that are along their journey. Yeah. And not lighten them up like I thought I was gonna do. And that backfired on me. Well,
and it goes to that piece of meeting people where they're at. And like, what does that mean? You know, so when we think about action, what does it mean to meet folks where they're at? And so after the summer of racial reckoning, there's been a lot more white folks who want to be involved in racial justice work, and more folks of color too.
Yeah.
And so I think about what it meant for someone to meet me where I was at and see something and invest in me. And, you know, we've talked before, you know, for folks who are listening, this notion between the difference between calling out and calling in.
Yeah.
And Ismalis, you know me. One of my foundational philosophies is what I call loving accountability, which means I both hold myself accountable about what I do and do not know about race. And how do I not shame myself or get caught up in the guilt of it, but just keep moving forward?
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep forming just relationships, keep taking action. And if I'm true to what I'm saying, which is I want to build a larger, healthy collective of white folks who are taking action for racial justice, that also means that I have to hold them in loving accountability. Yeah. Which is not shame them for, you know, why didn't you come to the party 10 years ago, 5 years ago? You know, I think it's a good reflective question, but not until I've formed a relationship with you. Yeah. And asked, what brought you here now? And I don't just mean here, meaning protests, because I think some white folks get caught up in like, well, you know, I can't go to protests right now because of COVID, or, you know, I'm just not able. Because there's lots of other ways to take action.
Okay.
And so part of that's the interpersonal. So with the folks of color in my life, or noticing that I don't have relationships, deep, authentic relationships with folks of color in my life, and thinking about what I might want to do about that. And I can think about policy and procedure. I can think about what's happening if I have children at my children's school in terms of curriculum. I can get involved with the school board. There are lots of different ways that I can get involved with racial justice and racial equity and take action while I'm learning and working on my consciousness.
Okay, I want to ask a question about this.
Okay.
Because this has come up in a lot of our work, and especially in thinking about white people, and this notion of, well, those book clubs, right? And I don't want to, I mean, they're just doing all that reading. Like, what's your take on that, Christine? Like, because I have this belief, like, yes, the reading is important. And I'm also recognizing the ways in which I may, and I'm not trying to make excuses here, but what does it mean for me in my own racial consciousness to understand what may be attainable for white folks right now, given wherever they're at? Because I know for me, I came in with this notion of like, and this is what you need to do, and go fix that. And then I become more and more frustrated with white people. So I kind of wanted to touch that a little bit.
Well, I don't know that I can answer the question that you're asking about your racial consciousness, but what I can answer is, listen, book clubs are important. Like, building community and collectives for white people around learning about race is important. And that can't be the only thing that we do. I think that that's when we get criticism of, you know, summer of racial reckoning and you started a book club. And I coached a lot of white folks this summer. I'm like, don't quit your book club. Like, don't. Please stay in your book club. And what other things can we do? What other action can that be? What is the thing that you are learning about that's activating you, that you can take transformative action around? So it's a both and. Now, is it okay to be frustrated with white folks who are only like, oh, I'm not ready to take action yet, I'm still learning, I'm not ready to take action? I'm like, yeah. And how do I hold them in loving accountability and be like, I'm so glad that you are working on your consciousness. And what's it changing for you? What is that book that you're reading? So you read, you know, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. how's that transforming your actions? How's that transforming your relationships? What action is it leading to?
Solid.
Can I jump in here? We have a question about a book. Mary says she's almost finished reading Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad and is horrified at some of the atrocities. How accurate is the portrayal of plantation life?
I have not read the book, and does not minimize for me the possible atrocities that you're reading, right? And I don't know how accurate they are. And I think that's kind of, Christine, you bring up this point all the time for me about multiple perspectives. And I think for me in that question, it's.
So I took a deep breath.
You took a deep breath.
I took a deep breath. And I'll tell you why, because I was thinking about how does that question function for me? So as a teacher who taught American Studies and did an important piece with my co-teacher of how do we understand the atrocities that happened, and also paint the picture of the resilience and resistance and brilliance that was Black life and experience. And I haven't read that book by Colson Whitehead, but I've read many of his other books. But I always wonder about when we go to the questionings of, you know, is that really true? Like I certainly, in the study of what I've done of the history of slavery and in teaching it, like, yes, it's brutal. And even when it wasn't brutal, it was still brutal. And I think it's that reframe of what does it mean for one person to own another person? What human qualities have to be given up by the white person? What human qualities do I have to let go of in order to own another human being? And there's an atrocity in that, in saying that you can be bought and sold, your children can be bought and sold. So that's why that question, I always struggle with it, you know, is it true, or is it as widespread, or the atrocities that bad? And I think that yes, and the simple fact of owning another person is an atrocity.
And let's name a racial dynamic, right? You took a pause in your racial consciousness. Me as a Black woman, Black Latina, I want to provide an answer. And how that plays out constantly, right? What does it mean for me to have a belief that I can also pause?
Yeah.
That's that modeling and understanding and asking, what does race have to do with that?
And I wouldn't always have paused Ismalis.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there's definitely times when I want to be the sage on the stage, the white person who knows more. And that was also part of my pause. Because I'm wrestling with, how is this question landing on me? How am I being in just relationship with the asker and providing an answer, but doing it in a way that shows the stuff I'm wrestling with?
Yeah. Thank you for that. And this is why I learned so much in being in interracial relationships, right?
So are there other questions out there? Seeing that we have about 20 minutes
Pamela
left.
put something in the chat, and about, she's asking everyone to read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, to begin to understand the origins of race and caste in the US. A lot of people are talking about that book at work, and I think it's on the short list for something, if I'm not mistaken. And, you know, but working at the library, I have to say that I am not a professional librarian, but many times my colleagues will say reading fiction teaches empathy. And so I have read books The Hate You Give and The Help and Jodi Picoult's book, Small Great Things. And those books make me very uncomfortable. And, I think maybe some people would look down on some of those choices as they're not highbrow enough, but reading them, like reading The Help this spring was much different than reading it, I don't know when I read it before, maybe like 10 years ago. So it's, yeah. Oh, we have another question. How do we teach or show young children to be racially conscious, especially when you come from a family that is a rainbow of brown? Oh, especially in this day and age, because it is not taught in our schools.
Yeah. I'm taking a deep breath because that hit home. It hit home of what did it mean to be a part of what I thought was this beautiful rainbow. And yet the ways in which oftentimes I saw how color and colorism played out. Lighter versus darker skin. And what I will say is the teaching of that is the acknowledgement that there are the both and it's all part of the family. That there isn't one way, right way, and that, but I wanted to have more of those conversations as to why. And I wanted to talk about my feelings associated when some of the behaviors came that I didn't understand, that were rooted in race. And so I think that teaching goes to like being open. And if kids ask a question, what does it mean to be vulnerable enough to say, I don't know, but let's find out together. But oftentimes I would get the I don't know, or we ain't talking about that right now. And so for me, I would just say, how do you acknowledge that it's not, it's not being taught, and how do you celebrate that and bring that knowledge of what it means to be a rainbow brown in your family, right? Because that's different for everybody. So how do you, your family, how do we embrace all of it, both and the beautiful, the rainbow brown, and acknowledge why it's not being taught in schools?
I have a theory. Well, because, and it goes back to the racial identity piece. I mean, was it 80% of teachers in schools are white? Yep. And if we're being taught to be colorblind and we're not practicing having conversations about race, and in fact, like if you notice race as a little white kid, you're like, shh, don't say anything. Like, and you get these messages like, you're not supposed to notice. Of course we're noticing. Of course we're talking about it. Of course the messages from the larger society are getting through. They talk about the studies where kids by 3, kids know that lighter skin is better in our society, and they notice it. So even if we're not talking about it, like they're noticing it.
They notice it.
And so how do we build racial consciousness among white folks as well, so that we can talk about beautiful dark chocolate skin and not feel weird? Or to say like, oh my gosh, what a beautiful mocha, skin color. That's so gorgeous. And to be able to have my own comfort level and consciousness in saying, I notice race and I notice skin color. Yeah. And that I'm not going to shame little people for talking about it.
One, I think, Pamela, I'm kind of reading that second piece of like, I'm African-American, and Cass is at times very difficult to read. Right? And I think about the ways in which it is a tough pill for me to swallow, that often a lot of the pain and hurt that I have felt have come from people that look like me. But I was so angry because I didn't have an understanding as to why. Right? And what does it mean now for me to be in some spaces where colorism is at play, lighter skin and darker skin, and be able to name that dynamic within racial groups that where we're sharing skin tone, right? Like no matter what, we're walking through a door, people are seeing us as Black. But I also know that there are times where I'm palatable. And so how do I also acknowledge that and disrupt that narrative when I'm in spaces with other people who are Black? And that's been tough for me too, because that is my constant fight, so that I don't also become the oppressor. And it's painful for me to even think about that. So thank you for sharing that, Pamela. And there's pain in that.
And I do think about the difference in racial identity and racial consciousness. So what does it mean for me as a white person to read Caste? And I must say, if you have not read The Warmth of the Northern Sun, about the Great Migration, which I did not learn about until I was in my 30s. Never learned it as a white person. And yet Chicago is so absolutely constructed in its segregation by the Great Migration. So I would absolutely recommend that one too.
When I think about the guilt and the shame of the things we don't learn in school.
Yeah.
I want to go back to even like the brown rainbow. Like, what does it also mean and the impact when people of color don't learn about themselves, when there is no representation, and how painful that often becomes. Like, I dread being the only person of color in rooms and spaces. Because I'm like, damn, am I going to have to teach now? And how do I also stop myself from not telling the single story about everybody who's Black and everybody who's Latino? Because we're not a monolith, and I have my own lived experience. And that part for me is, I'm thinking back to what it means to be in just relationships. It's like, what are my parameters and boundaries so that whatever I say is productive and that is not rooted in stereotypes. So thanks for that, Christine. And Pamela, thank you again. Any other questions?
I don't see anything coming through.
We were both teachers, so we're really good at wait time, but we realized that might be terrible for podcasting webinars.
No, it's fine. Fine.
We're okay waiting.
Sure.
I think one thing I want to say, Ismalis, is you and I have been having a lot of these conversations lately. And sometimes we get the folks who are like, but you're just talking. I thought this was supposed to be about action.
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who feels like, that wasn't really that helpful? It's just two people talking about their experience.
Well, for me, I'd ask questions. So what about it was not helpful? Because I always have questions. But for me, as I think about this, I think about what you say all the time is like, you are the tool. Question is, you just got to figure out how to use the tool and where to use the tool. And I think having conversations is also action. Because for me, that was not, like, I remember bringing up things that were racially charged and being shushed. No. And so what does it mean to like actually provide some space and opportunity for people to do some reflection and conversation? That to me is action.
Yeah, and I think about the work that we do about leadership.
Oh yeah.
And as someone who has moved into more leadership as a white person in racial equity work, one of the things that I'm clear about is that I need to seek multiple perspectives, because I, as a white person, am not going to come up with the way to end racism on my own, because if we were able to, we would have done it already. And so what does it mean for me to be curious about other white folks and their experience? And like you said, like, white people aren't a monolith either.
Oh.
Right. So folks who look like me, right, who might identify as white or just present as white, but we culturally can have amazingly different experiences. Some of us are Jewish. And that adds a whole nother level when we talk about white nationalism and white supremacy. Because anti-Semitism is so part of that. I think about those of us who identify as Native and Indigenous, but appear to be white, present as white. Latinx.
Yeah.
Eastern European versus Western European. Folks who recently immigrated here as white people versus folks who've been here whose families have been here for a long time. And so, like, all of that nuance is important, and all of that perspective is important. In order for me to show up in an identity that I'm not just depending on you to teach me about racism, but that I have a clear sense of who I am as a healthy white person and what action I want to take.
When I hear you talk about this healthy racial identity development, right? Could you explain that just a little bit? Just a little bit.
What does it mean to be a healthy white person?
Yeah, healthy racial identity development.
Yeah, so the work of Dr. Janet Helms out of Boston College, she's a Black woman, so I want to be clear about this. And she was like, white people struggle to talk about themselves and race. And she's like, it's no wonder, because they don't have a sense of what does it mean to be white. They haven't had to examine it in any way from a psychological perspective. And so she just has this amazing framework that helped me realize, like, oh, so stuff I'm struggling with, like this cognitive dissonance of being taught to be colorblind, all at the same time I was getting racist messages about people of color, like, that's a dissonance part. And as a white person, one way to not deal with the dissonance is to ignore it. Like, well, I'm just not going to talk about race then. I'll just pretend it's not there. Versus a difference of like, okay, so let me lean into it. And how does it impacting me now in my ability or my inability to take action about race? If I feel overwhelmed, or I feel like I don't know what to do, or how could I know what to do because I'm a white person, that getting into that healthy space is like, oh, I have an option. Like, white supremacists don't get to own what it means to be white, which is what I was taught, right? To go back to our opening. And that I can be a healthy white person, meaning that I have a sense of what it means to be white. And there's lots that I like about white culture. And I can recognize when has white culture become oppressive, and when have I done damage because I've been acting out of that framework. And so for me, it's a healthy white racial identity is an aware one, a racially conscious one that's willing to be humble and make mistakes. And I'm still going to show up the next day. I'm not going to get shut down by it.
And I think, as you say, what next?
Yeah.
That is like key for me as a Black Latina. I show up the next day. Because I don't have a choice to not show up. And there's so many expectations when I do show up that I wonder what race has to do with if there was someone white standing next to me when they show up. And so I think about what next as white people, people of color, is like, yo, it's hard, it's painful, and what does it mean to show up? In whichever way you can.
I want to acknowledge that we're almost out of time. And I want to thank, I don't want to say your name wrong, Amarena?
Yes, that's a friend from here.
Oh,
One of the white girls I was talking about.
So I want to just thank you for the affirmation and appreciating the vulnerability that Ismalis and I are sharing in our identities. And I see that there's a question about books that you can recommend. There are so many, and I'm sure that Nina can talk about some ways that the library can help with that. But we will certainly provide lists, Nina, if you don't have them, that maybe you can share with the folks who've attended.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And right now, I think tonight it's going to go live on the website. There's a books for all ages for this topic. So if not tonight, it'll be there in the morning. And if it's not, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat, and you can email me to make sure that I follow up. Okay. And I don't know if, I didn't say this in the introduction because I didn't want to take away from tonight's discussion, but on Monday, November 9th, the group of suburban libraries are hosting Dr. Ibram, is that how you say his name? Ibram Kendi?
Ibram Kendi.
Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So you can register now, and it's going to be a very important evening. So. And I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. It's really wonderful. And I'm just impressed that people make time for the library. You know, you're not little children, they're not putting you in a stroller and walking you over. You actually make time as adults. And I'm always grateful that people do that. But for this topic, but for these women, for where we are right now, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists. It's wonderful. I could listen to you talk for hours. I wrote down the statements you say, you know, just relationship, hold space for people. And I am moved. So thank you.
It means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for making this happen, Nina. We appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.